Hello and welcome to this short revision session looking at the Weimar Constitution and whether it was an undemocratic organisation that didn't provide stable basis for government. You'll notice that I've highlighted some of the key terms in this question so that I make sure that I stay really focused and don't misinterpret the question. Especially important because sometimes the wording of questions might be similar to something you've answered before, but not quite the same. So, the Weimar Constitution was undemocratic and didn't provide a stable basis for government. For the purposes of this revision video, I am arguing that this is very accurate. So let's start with the nature of the Weimar Constitution's establishment to look at how it's not very democratic and didn't provide the basis for stable government. So some of the first evidence we've got that it's not democratic would be the nature of it being started. Ebert became Chancellor as a result of a revolutionary act, not as a result of him being elected into power. He was given the position by Max Baden after he resigned, having announced that the Kaiser had abdicated, although the Kaiser himself didn't abdicate. Max von Baden, or Prince Baden, actually just decided to announce it to the press after the Kaiser kept refusing to step down from his position. So it was a revolutionary act. It wasn't something that was chosen. It wasn't something that was voted for. Ebert was made Chancellor by someone else who decided it was time for the Kaiser to step down from power. Prince Max von Baden had written to President Wilson asking for an armistice, and President Wilson had said that Germany would not be issued an armistice or a peace agreement unless Germany adopted a democratic system of government. So even the adoption of a democracy within Germany isn't really a democratic process. It wasn't a democratic step. It was something that was forced upon them. So I would say it was an undemocratic constitution in that way as well. We can also see that it wasn't very democratic in the way that it seized power. If you consider the mutiny, so there's two ships mutinying at Kiel on 3rd of November 1918, which helped to cause the Kaiser to feel he'd lost support of the armed forces, as well as General Groener himself telling the Kaiser that the army would no longer fight for him. This wasn't democratic. However, there's a slight limitation to this argument. It's very difficult to replace an autocracy without some form of revolution. So although there's a form of revolution in Weimar becoming a democracy, that's sort of unavoidable. But certainly, unquestionably, the nature of Weimar's establishment was not democratic. So did Weimar provide a stable basis for government? Well, certainly initially, in the early years of the Weimar Republic, the answer to this question is clearly no, it didn't have much stability at all. Ebert didn't really have any authority outside of Berlin. There were angry, demobilised soldiers, the Freikorps. There were armed clashes and street battles, which were really common. Even the name itself, the Weimar Republic, is quite clearly a result of too much instability in the capital, Berlin. It's the reason it was called the Weimar Republic. The elections for the Constituent Assembly happened in the small town of Weimar because the capital city of Berlin was too unstable for them to hold the elections for the new government there. So even the name the Weimar Republic kind of illustrates the fact that it was not a stable basis for government. We've also got evidence that the government wasn't stable. It relied on the support of the army in order to keep control. That's not a democratic, stable government. We've got evidence of this as a part of the the Ebert-Groener Pact, which was signed on the 10th of November 1918. The army promised to support the new republic in return for them preventing the democratization of the army. And no further commitment to any kind of socialist revolution that many workers and soldiers were pressing for. That's not democratic, and nor is it stable. The Weimar Republic was reliant on the army to keep control, and the only way that they could maintain the support of the army, which they required in order to put down a number of revolutions, the Cat Putsch, for example, in 1920, where 12,000 men revolt against the government, the Spartacus uprising in January 1919, which is also sometimes called the January Revolution, and their earlier demonstrations in December 1918 where 16 were killed as well. All of these things required the support of the army in order to put them down. and the army was pressuring the government into adopting certain political positions in order to continue to support them. So that's not democratic or a stable basis for government. And if we consider the nature of the constitution, there's also major flaws which mean it's not going to provide a stable basis for government. So looking at the constitution itself, we've got the problem of proliferation of small parties. Because of the nature of the Weimar Republic as being a proportionally represented government rather than first past post, there were lots of small parties elected into the Reichstag, and that made it very difficult for them to reach majorities in the Reichstag when they're voting for decisions. And as a result of that, there's a huge number of coalitions required in government, so there's not enough majorities. That's not one major party making decisions, and that means lots and lots of parties having to work together. And the coalitions didn't really last very long, they were very short-lived. For example, there were 10 different coalitions, just in the first 4 years of the Republic, 1919 to 1923. That's not a stable basis for government if you have to keep electing new governments. In 1923, for example, there were 3 different governments in just 1 year. Furthermore, Article 48 is probably one of the best pieces of evidence that there was a lack of democracy within the Constitution. Although it's true that many countries have in their constitution some kind of caveat that that you can have some kind of martial law, or whoever's in charge can make quick decisions without having to get the support of the entire government in emergency situations. The president, who was only elected every 7 years in the Weimar Republic, and chose the chancellor, also not very democratic, was given the power to rule by decree in an emergency without any consent from the Reichstag whatsoever. So he doesn't even have to get consent from the Reichstag to rule by decree, in terms of whatever he decrees is an emergency. So yes, in a way, this is something that you see in many constitutions, but it's certainly not democratic, and it was something that was later misused by Hindenburg and then later by Hitler. However, we can't finish this revision video or argument without acknowledging that there were elements of the new constitution which were quite democratic. For example, proportional representation was a major step forward in many ways for democracy within Germany, or the Weimar Republic as it was known. Instead of Prussia, the largest state, which used to have dominance in making decisions previously in Germany, there were 35 districts of around 1 million voters. It was much more fair, the way that people were able to elect the new president every 7 years or elect deputies into the Reichstag. They were able to have referendums. If 1/10 of the electorate called for one, then the president would have to call a referendum. And there was a statement of fundamental rights made. So all Germans were equal before the law. Legitimate and illegitimate children or adults were seen and given the same rights, unlike they had been before. So there were major steps forward for democracy and for people's rights within the Weimar Republic, and that can't be overlooked. However, I think it's very clear that overall the constitution was fairly undemocratic and didn't really provide a stable basis for government. That's the end of this short revision video. Best of luck with your revision.